But I think people use this very limited language when they talk about boys. And even progressives, they'll be like, oh, boys can't sit still, boys don't like reading, boys in the classroom. When we use this very sort of sky's the limit language when we talk about girls, you know, you can be anything you want to be, you can do whatever you want. And then it's like, but boys will be boys. It's a double-edged sword. It sort of enables bad behavior in boys and sort of gives them a free pass. But at the same time, it's so limiting. It's not giving boys a really broad sense of who they can be in the world.
Welcome to This Anthro Life, where human stories unfold in all of their remarkable complexity. Today's conversation takes us into the fascinating and challenging realms of masculinity, motherhood, and the nuanced battlegrounds of boyhood in modern society. I'm your host, Adam Gamwell. Now, in a culture pulsating with polarized views, how do we nurture our boys to navigate the tightropes of identity, vulnerability, and societal expectation? So I'm really excited to be joined today by insightful journalist and writer Ruth Whippman, author of a new book called Boy Mom, where we'll deep dive into the heart of these questions. Now, from the instant that a boy is labeled buddy instead of sweetheart, even as a baby, to the invisible crises nurtured by screens and unspoken societal cues, we'll explore the landscape shaping our sons, brothers, and friends. And this isn't just about raising boys. It's about unpacking the collective responsibility of nurturing emotionally connected, resilient individuals in a world that often prefers silence to empathy. So let's dive in and unravel the narratives that bind us, in the hope of weaving together a more inclusive tale for the next generation. Stay with us. I thought your book was great, like really interesting, and
thank you.
And a fascinating deep dive, and it was particularly well timed. Both me and my partner were very excited when you came onto my radar, because we actually have a baby boy due this month.
Oh, like congratulations. Oh my gosh. Wow. Yeah. So you're right in at the start. So yeah, exciting. So I am a journalist. So my favorite thing to do, I think, is to just kind of dive into a topic and really try to understand it. So I start from a place of, I'm not trying to start from a place of expertise. I'm trying to start from a place of lack of knowledge, and to take the reader on that journey through, understanding this topic with me and kind of hold their hand through it, but do it through the lens of my own experience. And I did this, so America the Anxious, it was kind of about moving, I'm British, I was moving from the UK to the US and sort of navigating this totally new cultural landscape and this kind of obsession with wellness and happiness and what it did to the kind of psyche and the self and what it did to us as a culture politically. So, I looked at the self-help industry, I looked at, I looked at the workplace, I looked at trends in positive psychology and all the rest of it. But Boy Mom was a much more personal, so here it is. Boy Mom was like a much more personal journey for me in a way. I am a mom of 3 boys, and my third son was born right as the Me Too movement was exploding. So I already had 2 little boys, and I was pregnant with a third boy, and suddenly there's this like horror show of male bad behavior, just like one thing after another, and every time I open my news app, there was some other like terrible thing that some man had done. And it kind of seemed like we escalated, and I don't think this was what was actually happening, but how it seemed, as this heavily pregnant with a third boy mom, was that, we kind of escalated from like Harvey Weinstein as a sex offender to like every man in America is a sex offender. And, obviously we're going deeply wrong in the way that we're socializing boys. And suddenly, I'm a feminist. I grew up with a sort of second wave feminist mom. She was quite, in all the good ways, she was quite dogmatic in my childhood about transmitting feminist values to me. And I think boys was something that I just really hadn't considered that much before I had them. And almost, I'm ashamed to say, almost before I had my third one, right as Me Too was happening. So that was the kind of catalyst that I really was like, oh God, we really need to look at male socialization, where we're going wrong. I mean, every parent presumably thinks that they want to raise their child to be a good person, or maybe not every, but in general, that's what people want. But obviously, we have these huge blind spots, that these things are allowed to happen at such a systemic level. So I sort of wanted to look at my own parenting. I wanted to look at the wider culture through the lens of the home and parenting. And then I wanted to look at sort of wider systems of masculinity and how they were impacting boys and the culture of manhood. So that's what, I tried to mingle my own story and my own very complicated feelings, actually, and inner conflicts about raising boys in this moment as a feminist, and sort of really dig into those conflicted feelings. I didn't want to be like, here's your 5 steps to raise a feminist son, I think I felt very conflictedly about it. Is that even a word? I felt very conflicted about it.
Sounds like a real word.
And I wanted to kind of explore those conflicted feelings rather than try to deny them.
I think that's such an important point too, and I appreciate that. That really came through in the book too, because it's like, how do we wrestle with these questions that are quite profound in terms of like how we both interact in the world as bodied beings, but then also how do we raise children in that space. But then there's such a, since we're in this also kind of politically or polarized or politically fraught kind of space, that like it's very hard to come down with an answer that says we actually need space for nuance.
Yes.
Right. That we have this like knee-jerk reaction to on either side of the political spectrum.
Yes.
But one thing to lead into that, I'm curious. I want to ask you something that stood out to me is that when you were walking us into the book itself too, you also said something that I also was like, oh, this is great. You said, I didn't have this kind of resource. I needed this kind of book. And so that's why I had to write it. So I appreciate you writing it, because I also needed this kind of book.
Oh, thanks. I saved you the trouble of writing it.
What was not there that you were looking for, and that kind of inspired this way of approaching the conversation?
Yeah, so I think, this was back in 2017, and I think that has changed. There are more resources and books now, but what I felt was missing was partly something that was written from a mother's point of view. I think there is this idea with manhood and boyhood that it's this really sort of momentous thing that only men can really understand and only men can really engage with, and women can't possibly be, a full part of that conversation. And as a mom, you're just supposed to back off and let masculinity do its important thing. And I thought, well, that doesn't seem right, and it doesn't help me, because obviously that's not an option. I'm not going to back off, I'm their mom. And partly I wanted something that sort of mixed, that was really honest about the contradictions, the conflicts, the emotional journey, and that kind of didn't have the moral certainty that I see sometimes in these kinds of things, either in cultural critique or in parenting books. It's like, do these 5 things and then you'll get the exact child you want. And obviously that isn't true. These are people with their own, their own views, their own preferences, their own agenda that we can't necessarily affect. So I just wanted something that was honest and that was vulnerable and that was really owning those complicated and difficult feelings, I think.
Did you find that there was a challenge in the idea you quoted? There was an organization that was looking at kind of the study of male supremacy, I think. And which is a very intense sounding title of an organization.
I think that was deliberate. Yeah.
But this idea that you from them, that they're kind of bringing up this idea of how can we have more space to kind of have these conversations, right? If we're asking these bigger pieces, and is there I'm kind of curious to think about your process, and you're thinking about the way of the pathways of kind of how you figured out who to talk with, and obviously boys make sense,
Yeah.
But how you kind of went through that process of figuring out who makes sense to converse, and whether that is that reflected? I'm kind of curious too in the chapter structure in terms of boys and girls stories into schooling, into online life. There's a good narrative flow, but I'm curious your thoughts about that.
How I did it. Well, just to speak to your first point about the Institute for the Study of Male Supremacy, or whatever it was. So the way that I used that quote in the book was that this was within the context of whether or not to engage with incels. I don't know if your listeners are familiar with the incel movement, but they're a pretty sort of repulsive corner of the manosphere. And in a way, they were kind of my greatest fear, for my sons, that this was what they were going to get involved with. And they're these sort of super online men, and their kind of defining thing is that they feel very lonely, and they feel, they don't have sex. And so they kind of congregate around this, and they're often very misogynistic. They engage in all this hate speech that, at the fringes, it's a really, really horrible movement, and they've been associated with mass violence. And, you know, they've been responsible for, or people involved in that movement have been responsible for school shootings, for mass stabbings. There was one recently in Sydney, which was an incel-motivated killing. And the quote from the Institute for Research into Male Supremacy was that journalists had to sort of counter the instinct to sympathize with these guys. You know, that we shouldn't engage with them, that we should just write this off as this like disgusting, terrible, misogynistic, horrible movement. And we shouldn't sort of enter into this process with any empathy because, you know, it's almost humanizing these people where they shouldn't be humanized. And I think this was kind of a microcosm of something that I was seeing in a much wider, conversation, which is just like, men are privileged, they have all these advantages, they're the beneficiaries of patriarchy, time for them to shut up, for everybody else to have a chance. And if you kind of engage with people who are doing difficult or horrible things, then you are in some way sort of giving them a platform that they shouldn't have. And my approach in this book was really different. I thought, you know, not just with incels, but across the board. I did talk to incels. I interviewed incels as part of my research, and they appear in the book. And I was very keen to humanize these people and to engage with them and to find out, you know, what is actually going on for you. I think we can't really understand how people get to these places without seeing them as human beings that have been through some terrible path. And until we really engage with people as humans, then I think we're never going to be able to do that. And so right from the beginning, I wanted to speak to boys, you know, and to hear what they were actually saying. I think there's this thing in the culture wars where boys kind of get silence from both sides almost. It's like, on the one hand, you've got this kind of like right-wing tough guy stance, which is just like, man up, don't talk about your feelings, don't show your emotions, be a man. And then on the other side, you've got sort of these voices from the progressive left, which are saying, you know, time for men to shut up. You know, everybody else deserves a chance. It's important to, you know, let a woman speak, let another marginalized person speak. And I think the effect, you know, those two things aren't quite morally equivalent, but I think the effect is that boys end up getting silenced from all sides. And this is leading to this like huge groundswell of rage and loneliness and lack of connection, lack of belonging. So I was like, you know, this isn't getting us anywhere. You know, it's easy to posture and be like, this is my opinion. But actually, I think we really need to engage with boys at an emotional level to understand these forces and what's going on. So that was always, you know, to answer the second part of your question, I think that was always my motivation, was to really just talk to these people as humans. And I won't always agree. I often won't agree. But, you know, let's hear from them, what they're actually saying. And in terms of the chapter structure, I think it was just, you know, I start in very early childhood. I think that sort of made sense chronologically. And it also made sense from my own parenting journey. I was parenting an infant at the time. You know, these patterns are set in place very, very early in childhood for boys. And so I sort of wanted to look at how it started, like right from the start, you know, how masculinity gets constructed right from the ground up. So I started there. And then I think sort of, you know, I went on to popular culture and how these stories, you know, through the TV, the books, the movies, how that sort of infiltrates. And then I think school was a natural next step. And then I think I got into the sort of older age groups and the manosphere, screens, you know, things that were more affecting teenagers.
I found the structure itself actually very helpful to kind of take that narrative journey with you in that point. But I think I also did this other bigger question. So I didn't actually ask the question about the quote itself. But yeah, but that was, thank you for walking through that, because that was the other thing that I thought was an interesting challenge of how do we approach these kind of conversations is like, there's these, you know, like the kind of like journalistic challenge of like, typically one might want to sympathize with. And as an ethnographer, anthropologist, like we typically do that too with the people that we spend time with and interview and tell stories around. And so there's this kind of back and forth of like, how do you both not agree with things that people do, but then also tell stories that are sympathetic to their humanity?
Yes.
And that's like, I think an important challenge, especially in these kinds of spaces. Because one of the things that you point out, and I think you rightly pointed out in the book, and then we're kind of saying here too, is that there is like, again, not this moral equivalence in terms of power, like, but there is a challenge when we're talking about questions of privilege and how those, for an adult, how that doesn't quite really well map onto to boys or girls, is especially adolescents that don't have a lot of power or capital, social capital themselves. So it's this really interesting, like tougher conversation that we actually have to have of like, when we say privilege, how does it actually get activated in what context, right? and how that's different for an adolescent boy who's depressed and feeling isolated versus a Harvey Weinstein, right?
Absolutely. And I think those ideas of sort of power and oppression and privilege, as you say, they don't map well onto teenagers. They don't map well onto children. And they don't actually map well onto our current moment, I think, in terms of gender more broadly. I think a lot of even adult men feel like they're not particularly privileged. And, you know, especially men who are not economically privileged. And so I think it's a lot more nuanced. And we get this very blunt instrument, which is just like male privilege. But also, even within that paradigm, male privilege comes with very explicit harms as well. You know, patriarchy harms men. And those are not just incidental. It's not like, you know, I think it works in a different way from like racial privilege or, you know, white privilege or economic privilege. Because like written into the very script, it's not these kind of incidental things, but like written into the script of patriarchy are all these norms which are really harmful for men and boys, which are, you must be masculine, you must be tough, you must be emotionally stoic, you can't show your feelings. And those things get in the way of men's humanity, boys and men. They get in the way of their emotional connection to themselves, their connections to others, their friendships, their ability to find intimacy. You know, so I think that privilege, I think it's worth bearing in mind, but it is not the whole story.
Yeah, and I think that's such an important point too, because it's like when we can take more account of that, when we provide more space for that more nuanced conversation, we can actually ask ourselves, right, when we see something like that, there's quite a double-edged sword when it comes to things like, you know, privilege and patriarchy too, right? And I was actually looking at recently, you know, on your, I just recently joined your Substack, also to dive into that, because I want to, yeah, I'm going to keep the story going too, you know. So, but it's like this interesting idea that, you know, you recently were writing about this idea of how can we shift conversations, right, in terms of like, and what has feminism as a movement, like, you know, second, first, and third wave in this case too, of like asking questions of like such important strides of work that has done for like women's and girls' liberation and for broader questions around gender, right? But then like there can be this empathy gap in terms of when we're trying to then bring a conversation over to boys or boyhood, because typically that's like been both the bad guy, literally, and you know, on one form some kind of victim, right? But then like in between those two is this interesting challenge around like male tears, mugs, and male pain as a area of focus to converse about, right? And like, is it legitimate to do so, right?
Yeah.
So I'm kind of curious just to talk about this a little bit too, and get this sense of like setting the stakes up of like the challenge of how do we have these conversations that provide space for nuance when we're talking about politically charged and emotionally charged work that is righteously angry.
Yes.
You know.
Yeah.
And trying to find a path forward.
I mean, it's such an important question, and it's such a complex question, because I think what we're dealing with now is this kind of micro generation of adolescent boys. You know, the boys that were just going through puberty when Me Too happened are now of voting age. So they're now 18, and they have this like very ahistorical, very unusual experience of manhood and boyhood. The backdrop of their adolescence has been this whole conversation about men, and quite, you know, a very, very difficult conversation where they have seen all this righteous anger from women and from feminists with the Me Too movement, which has been so important. Of course, that conversation has been important. But at the same time, you know, growing up with that psychologically, I think is incredibly hard. And it wasn't these people that did that, you know, that it really is a case of the sins of the fathers. And, you know, to what extent can we expect today's boys to take on the responsibility of yesterday's men? And like, how do we have a conversation about, you know, what does it feel like to be a boy and have your sexuality, your early sexual development framed in terms of how harmful it is? You know, I think the conversation around sex for boys has been almost one that's been framed in terms of assault and rape and harm, which is, of course, an important conversation, absolutely, but it can't be the whole conversation. And I think that feminists, you know, of which I consider myself one, have adopted this tone towards boys and men, which comes from a place of righteous anger, but is very much, you know, has gone to a place of kind of mocking and ridicule and demonization, which I don't think is actually helpful for anyone, because as I've said, many times in many ways, patriarchy harms everybody. It harms men, it harms boys, and feminism could actually be a friend to boys, but actually boys are turning against the movement. They're moving radically to the right, this generation of boys. They're turning towards masculinity influences, towards like the Andrew Tates of this world, the manosphere. And they're more likely than their fathers and their grandfathers to believe that feminism is harmful. For generations, we were getting more progressive generation by generation. And now it's like that trend has radically reversed with young men. And so something's going wrong. The progressive left really needs to find a way to communicate with boys in a way that's not shaming, that's not mocking. And, I feel like I'm at risk of becoming one of those right-wing politicians who suddenly starts, seeing women as people when they have daughters. This phenomenon where they're like, as a father of daughters, I suddenly care about women. And it's just like, oh, bullshit, why didn't you see women as people before? But I think I had some of that when I had sons, because my job is to be their mom and to advocate for what's best for them psychologically and, within a broader context of justice. But, I think I hear this conversation, which is so negative and so damaging. And I think this is not going to bring them in. No one goes towards a movement that says, you suck.
It's one of those, because it's like my brain is still kind of racking with and wrestling with these ideas too, and because I think it is such an interesting challenge point, right? Where it is like, how do we provide that space for the more nuanced conversations while acknowledging, again, like the rightful roots of anger and progress, and then also understanding that we're seeing conservative responses to the boyhood question or the masculine question, right, that are giving very definitive answers, which is typically conservatism's very, one of their superpowers, for better or for worse, probably worse, where we see more on like liberal left, they're more likely to talk about abstract ideas and we'll say we need more nuance, but even if it doesn't necessarily enter into a dialogue that way, right, by actually providing some of that space for it. So I think you're telling an interesting line here of how we can provide more space in that conversation. And I think also the way that you focus on, and like we can dive into some of these issues too, of like the emotional pieces, or like basically like some of the architecture of masculinity, right? It's on some level it's going to sound familiar, right? And you've said some of them before, like there is kind of the idea of strength and like the, easily maps onto superhero personas and things like that. But then also like, some of the other challenges, like I appreciated the way that you were wrestling with early on in the book, the not like never wanting to go into the biological deterministic camp, and like there's not really differences. Like it's all like nurture versus nature. So I'm curious, like in terms of how boys versus girls are raised and like what their differences might be. So I'm curious, like to talk a little bit about this, of like how your understanding of nature versus nurture has kind of evolved through this project.
Well, it's
an ongoing question.
It's such an interesting question, this, because, I have looked at this research. There's this big body of research on nature versus nurture, whether gender differences are like hardwired or socialized. And the problem is like nobody's really looking at this research objectively. Everybody goes into it with an agenda. So whether that's the people reading it or the people conducting it, everyone starts from the starting point. And I think traditionally the sort of feminist approach has been like to minimize the biological differences and to say that all the differences are socialized, pretty much. And the sort of opposite approach is that, boys will be boys. That's just the way they are. It's an inevitability. And we just have to sort of work around the way that boys innately are. And kind of masculinity is this sign of authenticity. And, to mess with that is, is to sort of mess with boys' essential selves or to try to feminize them or whatever. And I think that in a way, it almost doesn't really matter what the research says, because nobody's really looking at it in good faith. I think there is some good evidence to show that there are some, on average, biological differences, or some differences that are rooted in biology. There's some very good evidence to show that a lot of it is socialized. I think probably it's a case of there are these small tendencies at birth, which we then bring bring was socialization. But I've struggled with it as a mom because, I came to this from the feminist perspective, which is like, this is all socialized, none of this is innate. And, I'm going to do better. I had all this hubris. I was like, I'm going to raise these sons who are this and who are that and who won't be into, and then obviously my sons are all, it's changing a little bit now, but they were the most wild, the most physical, the most rambunctious, the most like everything that people say, and I think I wrote a piece for my Substack recently about the whole boy mom conceit, which is, this hashtag that's online, and all these women online who identify as boy moms, and they're like, oh, boys will be boys, and it's, and I always push back on it. I was like, I don't want to be that person, but then here I am, that person. So I don't know, and I use the title boy mom for my book in this sort of quite tongue-in-cheek way. I was sort of exploring it rather than sort of identifying with it absolutely. But yes, I definitely at many points have felt, oh God, this is just this like ancient biological force that I am fighting, and nothing I do makes any difference. And make of that what you will.
Yeah, it's funny though, because it's right. It's like it's the point that data is never neutral, right? In that like numbers don't speak for themselves, and so
right.
it's like there's one thing to collect data, then there's another thing to interpret it, and then also then how you interpret it for somebody else.
It's so true.
Right?
Yeah, and people will, you'll see different groups of researchers taking the exact same data set and coming to completely different conclusions from it. So, yeah, I think everything in that area with a grain of salt. And I think, that for a while, the feminist sort of idea that we have to sort of root all this in socialization, you can see where it came from, because this brain science has been used to oppress women for hundreds of years, There's all this ridiculous historical examples of why women couldn't possibly be suited for the workplace or for, anything other than, childbearing throughout history that they've co-opted this data. So, similarly with race, with all of these things. So this, you can see why that this has come about, but then it can feel, I think I've had different relationships with this all along, depending on how badly my kids are behaving, honestly.
Yeah. No, I mean that makes perfect sense too. Where it's like, okay, sometimes it's like lived is then it will shape a little bit of how we like experience or interpret something with that too. But I'm curious to like one of the interesting things that like also kind of came out of this like back and forth conversation, like broader, but in research and in society too, it is that like the idea that like the boys will be boys kind of like, biological determinism are like just, that's the way boys are hardwired, this is the way girls are hardwired. And it's interesting that like some of them, the social metaphors or language that came out of that, like that like a lot of feminists did a really good job of waking us up to saying, hey, wait, why are we biologically determining, saying that women are like better for X or men are better for Y? But then it's now kind of okay to be like, boys are like dogs, right? And like, but if you said the same thing about girls, you'd be like, no, like we don't say that anymore. That's really interesting.
I think we've moved on the conversation about girls in a way that's been really positive. And so, even if there are some innate differences, we tend to focus on the socialization piece. So when good faith, or when progressive people talk about girls and maths or girls and STEM or whatever, they don't say, oh, well, they're innately not as good at boys as doing this stuff, then it's not innate. They'll be like, well, they haven't had the chances, they haven't had the opportunities, they've been socialized away from this stuff. But I think people use this very limited language limiting language when they talk about boys at the moment. And even progressives, they'll be like, oh, boys can't sit still, boys don't like reading, boys in the classroom, and I think we aren't, when we use this very sort of sky's the limit language when we talk about girls, you can be anything you want to be, you can do whatever you want. And then it's like, but boys will be boys, and I think it's a double-edged sword. It sort of enables bad behavior in boys and sort of gives them a free pass. But at the same time, it's so limiting. It's not giving boys a really broad sense of who they can be in the world, or that they could be better or have more interests or do different things, And
I mean, it's interesting because it's like, at what at what point does it start, right? But obviously it's almost like an epigenetic phenomenon right there that comes from our parents to us to beyond, but like
Yes.
so I'm kind of curious to think about this with you as well, where it's like, as you're tracing some of these, the roots of experience, I guess, one of the examples you point out, which something that the first time I heard this, it really irked me. And you said it for the same reason, was like when I first heard little boys called buddy. When I first that immediately stood out to me the first time I heard that. I was like, that's a weird thing. And like my immediate first thought, like when it was years ago, was like that they're embarrassed to be sweet to boys. It's like, that was my literal first thought. And I didn't now I'm like, okay, good. I feel justified that I thought that, 10 years ago.
Yeah.
Oh,
that's so interesting that you did, because I was actually worried about putting that in the book. I mean, just for context, the way that came up was, when my son went to kindergarten, there was this like male volunteer at the gate on the first day, and like these two little girls were going in front of him, and he was like, "Hi, sweetheart," and "Hi, sweetheart," and then my son walks through and he's like, "Hi, buddy," and like gives him a high five, and it was just this whole different tonal register, this whole different stance, this whole different thing. And it's like, people don't call little boys sweetheart. He's in kindergarten, he's 5 years old, he is a sweetheart by any definition, but yet he's already tracked into that sort of masculinity system, which is all this kind of like defensive, hey dude, and hey bro, and hey buddy, and and I'm glad that you responded that way, because I was worried about putting that in there, because I think people are often like, oh, for God's sake, it's such a nothing moment, it's such a small little moment. But, life is made up of these tiny little moments and these tiny little differences, and they build on each other, and they really build a sense of like how a person sees themselves in the world and how they feel they have to behave. So in and of itself, it's kind of nothing, but it's part of this whole context. And I said that my other son, actually, literally on the day he was born, the nurse was like cleaning him off, and she's like, "Oh, buddy," and you're like, you don't want to emasculate this like a 3-hour-old baby or 1-hour-old baby or whatever. It's
it is.
Anyway,
it's just this funny thing, right? It's that like, because again, it's like it's a great example where it's not like it's intended to be a kindness, right, by the person that was saying it, right, but it's like, it's funny because you're also 100% right, and that was like, it also tipped my anthro antenna, right, was when you're like, it's these small moments that like don't mean that much to anybody, but that like over time those count up and like basically mean, this is what it means, this is telling a boy what it means to be masculine, or to be a man, or to be a boy.
Yes.
And like,
right. And I think the reason, you said like people are embarrassed to talk to boys like that, and I think that's absolutely true, but I think it's also protective, because we know that the costs of emasculation are really high for boys. We know how shameful it is for a boy to be seen as girly or feminine or weak, and so we instinctively protect them by like not drawing them into, we say, "Hey buddy," for our sakes and for their sakes, it's like it's a kindness, but it does help to build this invisible system of masculinity. And I think we have, going back to your earlier question, I think we focus much more on the harms to girls of that, because, you can also see how being called sweetheart, and every woman will have some experience of being in a meeting and some guy being like, "Oh, sweetheart, could you?" And you're like, "Oh God," it's so patronizing, and it sort of excludes women from power. But then the part of it that we don't see is that it kind of excludes boys and men from intimacy and connection and nurturing.
Yeah. So let's dive into that point. So I think that was like, I guess if there's like one central kind of thesis idea, I think it's about it. It kind of points us in this direction where that, if we're creating a false equivalence of what privilege gives and what doesn't give, like I think you did a good job of pointing out this idea that actually, while it may ostensibly give some forms of power, it actually does the worst thing that it does, actually, and like that's actually worse than giving power is this idea of like removing the capacity and the offer of intimacy and even emotional attachment to oneself and to others, as like a coded way of being. So I mean, I don't know if maybe that's not the right reading, but like, I'd love to kind of walk through that idea.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great reading of it. That's exactly what I found, like over and over again, in a million little buddy sweetheart moments, and big ones, small ones, that masculinity and patriarchy cut boys off from intimacy and emotionality, and it's really harmful. in so many different ways. And it's leaving them lonely, it's leaving them isolated, it's leaving them disconnected from their own emotions, it's leaving this sort of mental health crisis amongst boys going very much under the radar, because it means that it doesn't even show up in the statistics. Because when a pollster calls and says to a teenage boy, are you feeling depressed, are you feeling lonely, they say, no, I'm not, because to say yes I am would be weak. So it's this invisible crisis. And I think there's this sort of circular logic, because we value what men value, and we sort of devalue things that are associated with women. It's like we overvalue power and we undervalue connection and intimacy, which means that this problem becomes even more invisible. Men get power, which we think is the most important thing to have, so we consider that to be the privilege. The more power you have, the better off you are, without really seeing the lack of intimacy as a real loss. We don't value it enough to even name it as a loss.
And the funny thing is, like, it's not funny, but like the curious thing there, right, is this idea that like we are seeing this kind of invisible, like, emotional health crisis, mental health crisis. Like it's interesting because it's like we see, like Gen Z has been a positive force in the world in terms of being much more explicit about that we have to have conversations about mental wellness and human well-being. Whether it's in the workplace, in school, or how I'm kind of approaching life. And like, that's a fundamentally important part. But then it's interesting because that's the same generation also that we're seeing a huge drove of boys kind of run towards this, not running to incels, but just like the more conservatism and like these kind of reactionary positions around masculinity. And so it's like, it's showing us like, it's literally is like the Gen Z is like the battleground, I don't want to say test case for society. I guess we're all lab rats in society, but in different levels, but like it's really interesting, like a challenge for this generation, and obviously for Gen Alpha coming after them. And we elder millennials and as everybody, as we work through this idea, like it's an intergenerational challenge, as well as then this idea of like, who's kind of willing to be at the forefront of it. And like, really, I mean, as we're seeing too, this idea, right, that so many boys, from kids coming into adolescence, right, are confused and are feeling isolated and left out. And it's like, it was, there's the really difficult statistic that you pointed to. I think it's that, young boys are 4 times more likely to commit suicide than girls of their peers, and this is around the idea of disconnection, alienation, and loneliness. And this is like it, to put nerd hat on for a second, like this was like, I remember the sociologist Emil Durkheim talked about, he wrote a book on suicide, now 110 years ago. And this is like the thesis though was like, why do people, commit suicide in a social world? And it was like primarily through when you feel isolation, like the more disconnected you feel from society, the more likely you are then to have suicidal ideation. And I read that subtext in like a lot of the stories that we're seeing here, this challenge that boys both, again, from like seemingly well-meaning comments of, hey buddy, give you a high five, into like these subtle pushes to not express emotion, right? To not be too cuddly. And then how that filters into like, actually I'd love to have you tell the story a bit about like how you and your partner like worked with your boys to like have them ask how their friends are doing. Because even this idea, like really thinking about young boy friendship, I thought was a really interesting conundrum that I reflected on this in my own life, like, 35 years ago. And I was like, yeah, that kind of, okay, that like tracks a little bit. Like from the 80s, I kind of remember, having boy friendships that like we didn't ask how people were. We were not trained to do that. Yeah,
I mean, my husband told me, it's not actually in the book, but he told me that and he said it in passing, it wasn't even like in the context of a conversation about friendship, but he told me that one of his best friends when he was at school, I'm not sure exactly how old, but maybe 9 or 10, the best friend's mother died, and my husband didn't even know about it until many years later. They just didn't talk about it, and they talked about whatever they were doing, their computer games, their sports, their things, but not emotions. I mean, that's quite an extreme example, but I see it with my sons. You'll say to them, oh, what's Ezra doing this summer? And they'll be like, I don't know. Or like, I remember this one time when a teacher, it was my oldest son, Solly, he he used to be really hard on himself. And I sort of saw this exchange with him and a teacher, and he had like he was doing some art project and it hadn't turned out the way he wanted. And he was like, oh, I'm so stupid, I'm so dumb. And the teacher was like, okay, well, who's your best friend? And he was like, Ezra. And then the teacher was like, okay, well, if Ezra was saying these things, you know, what would you say to him to comfort him? And I think the idea was that Solly would be like, oh, I would be so compassionate with Ezra. And then the teacher would come back and say, well, see, you should be more compassionate with yourself. But Solly was like, well, what do you mean? You know, how would I comfort him? What, you know, he just didn't have any frame of reference for like what he would say. His view was just like, well, this isn't my job to comfort him. And I say in the book, it was kind of like as if the teacher had said, you know, can you schedule Ezra's dentist appointment or something? You know, it was just like that far away from him that like, this is not my job to do that. And so, you know, when I started noticing that, and I think that shows up, you know, there's so many books and movies and stories for girls which are all about friendship and managing other people's emotions and tracking them and, you know, making sure that they feel all right and comforting them. You know, I see them everywhere for girls. But boys' stories are just about adventure. They're about battles. They're about enemies, not friends. They're about fighting, competition. And so they just don't grow up with this idea that other people's emotions are their responsibility. So my husband actually did a really great job of like coaching them and being like, okay, well, this bad thing has happened to your friend, and so you should ask them about it, and you know, this is how you ask them, and this is how you check in, and you know, and then you know, if they reply like this, then you maybe could respond in this way. And it just sort of breaking it down, because I think they just don't have a good model for, you know, for what that's like. And I think, you know, maybe it's hard to say how much of this is just my kids specifically and how much is boys in general. But I think that cultural forces are really pointing boys in this direction. Yeah.
And like, what are some, I'm curious, like some of the ones that you've seen that like the forces that are doing that. I mean, part of it is like, again, like the stories that we're telling, like, is there in, you know, I mean, Iron Man came to mind right away as like the superhero emblem.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. So, it's like, I think it's sort of two different, streams. So there's basically what they do get and what they don't get. So on the case of what they don't get, I mean, I remember, and I wrote about this in the book as well, that there was, you know, I saw this magazine in the store with my boys, and it was so clearly aimed at girls. You know, it had this like pink sparkly cover and like a friendship bracelet giveaway and, you know, all of these things. And then there was a story in this magazine, and it was about this girl, and she'd been invited to these two birthday parties that were happening at the same time. And so she took it upon herself to perform this like crazy feat of emotional labor, where she would like go between the two parties and pretend that she was a guest at both and not tell the people. And she'd go to like the games at one and then the games at the other and then the cake at one and the cake at the other, all so she didn't let down one of her friends. And this, like, growing up as a girl, you know, this story was just like everywhere for me growing up. This kind of story, which is just about friendship. The friendship is like driving the narrative, other people's feelings, you know, human drama. And I was like, my boys have never been given a story like that. And no story like that will ever find its way into their world unless I specifically make an effort to give it to them. And if I do, it will always have girls as characters. It will never have a boy taking on that role emotionally ever. So that's sort of what's absent. But then what is in their stories is that, you know, it's story after story of battles and fighting and competition. So it's always like two men or two sort of male non-human creatures in combat against each other. One wins and is a hero. The other one loses and is either a villain or dies. You know, or is just a loser, or like going out on action and adventure and story in that way. And there's nothing wrong with these stories. It's just that they have this completely steady diet of them. So they start to see human interaction as this sort of essentially competitive, combative endeavor. And when I was interviewing boys, that was something that came up over and over and over again, that they were always felt that they were in competition with their friends, you know, that male interactions were just this endless kind of like, who's the best, who's the strongest, who can be the funniest, who's saying the, you know, and it was not vulnerable or emotional at all.
And it's like, it's an interesting piece too, because that's also the kind of thing. I taught university for a number of years back, like on and off. And I don't teach now, but like I remember, when I first started teaching, I was much closer to the generation in age, and then as I got older, but they stayed the same age. The Matthew McConaughey quote, oddly enough, there. From Dazed and Confused, but this idea that I found my cultural references they became more split in terms of like musicians, folks are talking about, and like how they're kind of thinking and acting, and like and then so basically like also meme and conversation like started coming in more and more intensely in ways that I couldn't participate in because I just was not in youth meme culture anymore. I had to accept that I was old, but this idea is an interesting point of like how we see boys interact, right? Whether they're school age, college age, adolescence age. And in like just thinking about that idea, right? How something that even on the surface can seem more like joking, like memes, like, but it can also have this competitive edge to it, right? So like something that sometimes parents we may not even realize that there's a competitiveness of the joke of how can I be the funniest, right?
Absolutely. And I think when you see groups of girls and women laughing together, it's like a shared experience of like laughter and connection. And when you see boys and men laughing together, it is a kind of one-upmanship. And it's not necessarily that one is better and one is worse. It's just that they are these two quite distinct patterns. And I think the boys that I was talking to, a lot of them found it pretty stressful. They found this sort of constant interaction like this, like quite stressful. They wanted a sort of deeper emotional connection, or they wanted to just kind of let their guard down and just be. But they felt unable to do that. And that expression, you can never let your guard down. I had that expression. It was funny, like from several kids who had really different like social backgrounds used the same phrase to me about different things. One of them was talking about kind of banter in a social situation like you're describing, like who's the funniest, and it's this like endless comedy bit, and you can never sort of let your guard down because then everyone will pile onto you and you'll be the butt of the joke. And then another guy who was this like black boy from this very rough neighborhood of East Oakland, talking about you can never let your guard down in terms of masculinity. You can never show fear or vulnerability because you'll be physically attacked. But it was sort of the same emotional valence to it, even though we're talking about quite different things. And, and I heard that same phrase everywhere. And I think a lot of the boys that I spoke to, if they did want to have that kind of emotional connection, they either got it from their girlfriends or from female friends. They just felt like they could never change those patterns with other boys.
That's interesting too, that we kind of see the same thing happening kind of, cross-culturally, cross-group-wise. And it tells us something important too. And this is, and how we've seen gender scholars and folks, Sherry Ortner, anthropologists and other folks have written that, like, typically also we see in even cross-cultural examples too, like there's always this, sometimes it's often kind of like stated, but it can be unspoken too, of the idea that like masculinity is something that has to be made and it can be lost, right? And we see people talk about the idea that you can lose your man card, quote
precarious,
unquote, right? As this idea of something that like, there's something wrong.
Yes,
oops,
Yeah, it's precarious, and that you constantly have to prove it and reprove it and reprove it. It's never this settled question. It's just, it's always this precarious state. And I think that the boys I spoke to, they didn't quite articulate it in those terms, but their sort of feelings that they were talking about really spoke to that. And I think the thing about masculinity, you hear gender scholars talking about multiple masculinities and how it's different across cultures. But what was really striking to me actually was like, yes, there are variations, but like really the similarities was so much more striking to me. You never see a culture where masculinity is something that you just be like, whoa, that's completely different, that I'd never heard of that before. And actually masculinity is expressed through emotional vulnerability or through, it's always defined in opposition to femininity. It's always about not being a woman, not being gay, And so I think people know the rules. It might slightly vary across cultures, but I think everyone knows it when they see it.
And that's exactly right. And that's the kind of interesting part there too, that like it's often, and this is, feminism's correct critique, right? That it's like often like the masculine has been the norm, which means it doesn't get talked about, even though you know what it is, right? And oftentimes that's why you don't talk about it, because you know what it is.
Yes,
it's the unspoken
exactly.
norm, right? And why we have to critique
right, exactly. It's the default.
I think what's interesting with that too, and like feel like conversationally we have to go back to incels just because we mentioned them up top and that kind of went away from them for a little while. But like the listeners are probably like,
hey,
sorry, not
gotta
you.
get back.
It's like,
what about the incels?
But also why,
incels.
right? Because I think because I want to also kind of talk about the emotion of vulnerability part, and like things that we've seen so far of like there's oftentimes and we have slowly socialized boys away from emotional expression. In we said ultimately one of the problems there is intimacy, loss of intimacy. And the other side of it is like you can't ever let your guard down to that, I think, well said point there. So, again, to me, it was a interesting surprise is like the latter two parts of the book. You are talking with incels and then go to a very poorly titled rape con, which is a huge shocking. I was like, what is this chapter even going to be about? Like, I'm not sure if I want to go here, but it was a surprising visit, I imagine and so
yes,
but I guess when I think about so narratively, why are we going there? And so I think we're kind of setting that piece up here with the emotional limitation or stunting question. I think is interesting, but then let's go there. Then I want to kind of talk about what happens in those chapters is in both the surprise and and the kind of stories that you gathered from those spaces.
Yeah. So I mean, I guess the incels one first. So that was, I talked a little bit about why I was interested in incels. They were a great fear of mine. And I think the thing about incels is that they are a very extreme manifestation of a lot of mainstream trends that are going on in boy culture at the moment. So, I had sort of thought of them as being these kind of complete fringe freak aberrations. And generally, I'm not as interested in freaks. I'm more interested in what people on the fringes tell us about the mainstream, if that makes sense. And I think incels really speak to a lot of trends in boy culture. This loneliness, this socialization, this decline in sex, which is something that's supported by a lot of data, this kind of super online thing. And these boys who are in relationship with these systems of masculinity and this constant feeling of failure. So this is what the incels have this philosophy called the black pill, where they believe that masculinity is a hierarchy, and at the top there's these people called the chads, and they've kind of become a internet meme in general, but the chads are these good looking masculine sexually successful men, and then there's this kind of beta males below them, and then right at the bottom are the incels. They've just kind of given up. They're short, they're ugly, they're overweight, they're they can't get laid, they can't get a girlfriend. And so they've just and so I think what sort of differentiates the incels from the rest of the kind of masculinity spaces is that most of the manosphere kind of gives men this hope. It's just you can be an alpha male. There's this thing called an alpha male, and if you just do all these things that I tell you, then you can be one. So it's sort of selling this false promise in a way. Whereas the incels have just kind of given up. They have lost all hope. They're never going to rise to the top. They believe it's this sort of rigid hopelessness that they believe that, all of this is predetermined by genetics. They're never going to be able to participate in these systems of masculinity. And so in a way, it's weirdly liberating for them. So what I found was when I spent time in all these incel spaces on their message boards and talking to them, was that they were the only boys that I came across who really felt able to share their emotions with other men. They're just we're never going to be masculine. We're never going to rise to the top. We're so emasculated that we're just going to be vulnerable and honest. And in incel spaces, there is some terrible, hate-filled, disgusting, awful stuff. Misogynistic, racist, anti-Semitic, everything. But there's also this real sense of tenderness and brotherhood and emotionality, which it was so weird to me because I was I thought I would see that in some kind of progressive therapy group or something. But here it was right in the heart of toxic masculinity central, the incel movement. So that was really interesting. And I went really quite in depth with a couple of incels. I talked to a few more that weren't in the book, but I sort of featured these two guys, one of whom was very sweet actually. And he was just this very vulnerable person who'd had, a very difficult and traumatic childhood. The other one was harder to like. He was really very misogynistic and unpleasant, but again, was just somebody who was dealing with a lot of trauma. And I think those two, you know, in a way, what was so scary talking to those guys was that what was really striking was not so much the differences between them and all the kind of regular boys that I interviewed, but more the similarities, that they were all actually talking about similar things to do with loneliness and masculinity and emasculation and connection and all of, you know, they were all coming up with the same things. The incels were more extreme, but they were kind of like the logical conclusion in a way. So that, you know, that was all very interesting. And I think, again, had I stuck with this sort of very rigid, don't humanize these people, I think I would have missed a lot, you know. Because I think it's very easy to say, yes, these people are terrible. And in many ways they are. But, you know, why? How did they get there? What are they missing? How can we change it? You know, how can we give them what they need elsewhere, outside of the manosphere?
Well, it's like that question that we offer, or we'll find people say like, well, a baby's not born racist. It's like, yes, that's true.
Yeah.
But then also like, then what would influence someone to become that way, right? And so it is an interesting question of like, we can disagree with your position and not like a lot of the other things that you're saying, but then it's like, is there a emotionally vulnerable or traumatized human at the core of that? Probably.
Yes. Right. And I think, you know, as progressives or as a progressive, I think in general, we grew up thinking, you know, look for the causes, look at the person, look at the whole person, you know, try to understand the systems that are at play and not just sort of condemn the individual, which I think, you know, there's this authoritarian streak on the left, which is just like, throw these guys in jail and never talk to them and never find out why, you know, which sort of mirrors this authoritarian streak on the right in other ways, which I don't think is helpful for anyone.
It highlights the challenge there, right? Where it's like that as much as, you know, if we're on whatever side of the political spectrum or arena that we find ourselves on, it's like we tend to ascribe like all the negatives to the other and not recognize when we ourselves might take on actually some of those qualities that we are aiming to either expunge or, you know, at least call out. And this is not a like saying gotcha. It's not a gotcha point, but it's more just like realizing that it's messy, right? It's like, it's a lot of gray area and there's a lot of nastiness as part of that, but it's like, it's gray.
Yes.
You know,
absolutely.
And like how we approach that, it's not, there's no, to your point, there's no one way to do it. There's no one way to raise a child. There's no one way to say, this is the actual, fix it by doing this specific thing.
Exactly.
You know, these 5 steps. I want to be just real quick. Are we okay on time? I know we're a little over the hour. Are you fine to chat for a little more? Or? Okay, cool. So like, let's talk a little bit then also about the other, also really interesting with challenge space, you know, like of going to the spaces, I think is the actual name of this conference, right?
Yeah. So I want to say this, which is just to anybody listening, this is an extremely fraught and difficult conversation. And I think it's very hard to capture in one answer. And I urge people to read the actual book because I think it's very easy to misinterpret people's words when they talk about this. And I think this is the chapter that I've been most nervous about in terms of, you know, dealing with a very, very difficult issue, which is, so I went, and it was one of the first things I reported actually when I started research for the book. It was a conference for boys and their families, and these are boys that had been accused of campus sexual assault. So who had been through, and usually it's the Title IX system in the university that handles this. So it, you know, someone will accuse a boy of sexually assaulting them at college, and it will go through this sort of, it's a system that kind of mirrors the court system, where they are essentially put on trial for this act. And then they're found either responsible or not responsible, which is like guilty or not guilty. And there are huge consequences, obviously, to being found responsible for sexual assault on campus. And so there was this conference that was sort of representing or sort of for a support group for these boys and their families. And I went to report on it, and I went very much in the spirit of, I'm a feminist. I think there's been this terrible, you know, I have lived through the Me Too movement. I have seen this like epidemic of sort of sexual harassment and sexual violence and how it shows up and how it's, you know, has been condoned for so many years and how women have not been listened to and how women have been disbelieved and gaslighted and all the rest of it. So I went to this conference very much in the spirit of just assuming, well, obviously these guys are guilty, believe women, and why are their mothers defending them? And I sort of was almost going in a kind of anthropological way to see, what is it about a mother that would make her defend her rapist son? How can I learn to be a mother that wouldn't do that? I had those kinds of feelings. And I had my certainties so profoundly challenged by that experience in so many complex ways. I went in very sure and I came out extremely unsure. I think there's quite a lot of evidence that there has been quite a serious miscarriage of justice in the Title IX system. And many boys have gone through a process where they've been found responsible for sexual assault in their university system and have challenged it through the courts, and have won lawsuits against their universities. I think there was this big push post Me Too, well, actually prior to Me Too, but sort of at the beginning of that culture, and more recently to for universities to listen to women, to take sexual assault seriously. And I think there has been a huge overcorrection, and there's lots of evidence to back this up. And I think it's a very subtle and nuanced point. And I really do not want this to turn into a conversation about, oh, women lie and they're making up all these sexual assaults and, it's not real. And to go back the other way, this is not what I want. I do not want this to be co-opted into that discussion. But I think there's been a real problem with due process in these things. And I think that the definition of what can be considered a sexual assault has expanded beyond recognition. I think several cultural forces have changed to make this a much, much more complex issue than I believed it was. And I heard some devastating stories there. Yeah,
it was definitely one of the more challenging sets of ideas to work through. But I will say, folks have, if you have not read the book, I highly recommend you do, especially because these last two chapters are really there's a lot there and there's a lot of density. And so it's tricky to talk through them in a podcast. So don't misconstrue kind of how we're talking about this in case we're saying, hey, are you on the side of these families? That's not the point. But it's interesting how you wrestle with these ideas that there's individuals that have stories that they're then retelling, and there's been legal cases against, and then it is one of these challenges too, because it does then brushes up against all of progressive feelings of hey, no, we believe women, this is an epidemic that's been going on forever.
Yes.
And then at the same time, then talking with these families in I found myself asking them, why would these, if they're first I'm trying to rationalize, okay, so if they were guilty, why would they come to these conferences with their families to say they were innocent? And just even the fact that this exists is a really interesting space in terms of a support group for these families and I don't know, it's this interesting back and forth of how do we I guess the bigger point I guess we can think about too here is it shows how hard it is to have these conversations, and how that thinking about this in general is immediately hard to talk about, right?
Yes.
It's kind of I don't want to say the wrong thing,
yes.
Which is also and this actually echoes one of the other main problem themes, right? Is that there are things that we're not supposed to say or not supposed to talk about, and that sounds like a conservative talking point, but that's not what I'm saying here. But it's just there's this idea, right, that there's a concern I'm going to step out of a landmine I didn't see.
Yes, right. 100%. And I think...
And that can get me thrown out. And in either way, it can get me thrown out, on either side of the aisle,
yes.
Which is the challenge part. And this is a great example, going through this exploration and talking with these families and hearing them. And even talking with incels too, in terms of if we're minimally providing space for them to tell their story, what do we see, right? And, how we can traverse and navigate that, we see it's become so tense that this is the polarization problem, right? That we kind of, it's difficult for people to have these kinds of conversations around very tense issues, for legit reasons. But it's interesting because then this is all again, to remind us that we're in this conversation about how we raise boys.
Yes.
Right. And what does masculinity mean, and what does it do to us, and how we interact with ourselves in the world, and and how does, again, both men and women and boys and girls act around one another.
Yes.
And how can we talk about that? Yeah.
Absolutely. And I think also this is very much in the context of boys feeling extremely frustrated with the mainstream conversations that are on offer about these issues. And so I think if you say to a boy, look, we're just shutting down this conversation, and that they will get the caricatured version of this. They will get the, well, women lie about sexual assault and, the whole thing's a nonsense. And unless we can have a really nuanced conversation where we actually acknowledge that there are problems with due process at the moment, and some of these things that they're seeing are real, maybe not through within the lens that they're seeing them, but their own concerns are not completely founded on nothing. But I think if we can have that conversation in a nuanced and thoughtful way, then I think that's how we draw boys in. I think to just shut them down and say, look, this is just not, it doesn't exist, shut up, is not helpful.
Yeah, I think as we kind of bring a lot of these pieces full circle to it, and we think about the one thing that I think we'd all love is here's the 5 steps to help us fix the masculinity challenge.
Yeah.
Right? But obviously that's not real. And if you were doing that, then we'd have a different conversation. But here's my 5-step process. But there are some truths, right? There are some truths that I think we can take away from a lot of this, right? And so let's walk through what some of those are, because this is not one of those okay.
Yeah,
well, that's it.
Do these 5 things. No. I think there are really hopeful messages that you can draw from all this. And I think they are, as you say, they do center around nurturing and intimacy and connection. So I think right from birth, we didn't really talk about this, but right from birth, boys receive less care and nurturing and positive touch and less responsive care than girls do. And so this is something that starts from birth. And actually, there is quite, when you talk about gender differences, there's a lot of good evidence that boys' brains are actually more immature at birth than girls' brains. And so they're actually more vulnerable and they need more care and more attachment. So there's this double whammy that they need more and they get less. So I think that is a huge thing that we can correct for, that I think people perceive boys right from babyhood as being angry and masculine and all of these qualities, which we, when a baby girl's behaving that way, we sort of see her as being sad and in need of nurture. So I think one big thing is early attachment, early nurture, early care is a huge thing that we can do differently. And that can start at any time. I mean, I say early, but, these patterns go on all the way through childhood. The buddy sweetheart thing is the boy is our buddy, we expect him to toughen up, and we don't pile on the nurture, the positive touch, the affection, the listening, the empathy. And we learn those skills of empathy from being cared for. We learn skills of care and nurturing from having that done to us. So I think, and you've got a baby boy coming along, I think we need to correct for it. We really need to think, we need to see boys as our sweethearts, not just our buddies. We need to give them that kind of care. We need to talk to them more about emotions and social things than girls need that. Girls will get that from the culture anyway. I mean, they need it too, but it's and the whole thing about boys will be boys is just this is what they're like, so give them more of what they're actually like. But I say the opposite, which is even if there is some biological reason that they are more like this than girls, or not as good at those skills, or not as empathetic, or not as nurturing, I'm not just saying that that's true, but even if it is true, our response to that should not be okay, we'll just let them fight each other to death. The response should be, okay, well, let's give them more of that stuff. Let's expose them to more of these things, expose them to stories of friendship and connection and love and intimacy, ideally between boys, if we can find them. Please, whoever is a children's book writer, please write the stories about boys' friendships. I'll buy them, and I think many others will too. So what they watch, what they read, and it's not about taking stuff away from them. It's about adding stuff in, I think, in terms of their toys, in terms of the kinds of games you play, in terms of the kinds of things you point out in the world, how you talk about emotions, so I think it's those kind of feminine coded things I think we need to give to boys, and to not see them as emasculating. I think we've got to stop expecting these kind of masculine things from boys. If that's the way they want to be, great. I'm not saying about policing them in the other direction either, but I think when we set that up as a as an expectation. You know, I always talk about this sort of positive masculinity. People, that's been the framing for the conversation. Like, how can we talk about positive masculinity or healthy masculinity? But, you know, which is sort of a start, but it's also just kind of reinforcing the idea that masculinity itself is like non-negotiable. You know, it needs to be some kind of masculinity, or else, you know, we can't. So, you know, just sort of freeing them from that paradigm, I think. Talking to boys about emotions, prioritizing in-person connection. I think screens, we haven't really talked about that, but that's a big thing that's affecting.
That's right,
you know, boys
We're
are
talking
spending...
on a screen too, ironically.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, boys are spending 7 hours more a week on screens than girls are. Yeah, right now, playing video games mostly. And it is taking away from in-person social time. Boys are spending much less time socializing in person than girls are, about 5 hours less a week than same age girls. And so it's about prioritizing in-person social time and, you know, coaching boys through those things. And there are lots of people doing great work in this field, you know, with boys therapy groups and social groups and all the rest of it. But just sort of bringing it into the home and being aware, you know, I think it's just sort of naming the problem is part of the, you know, it's the first step. I talk in the book about how little girls have developed these great, like, detectors, you know, for spotting sexism. And you see, you know, every sort of 5th grade girl can be like, that's sexist, that's sexist. But I think boys don't have the vocabulary to describe, or the social permission to sort of describe the ways that patriarchy affects them. So I think it's just about pointing these things out and giving them, naming the problem, giving them the space to talk about it.
Yeah, no, I think that's right on. And it's so important, right, to kind of give that social permission, right?
Yeah.
To be able to have those kinds of conversations and provide those spaces. And remember, it's like in the same way that, like, I know I keep harping on the buddy thing, right? But it's like in the way that buddy is not designed to be like mean or like, you know, have a negative impact. It's the same way we have to kind of think about, okay, well, what are we choosing to say to boys? How are we choosing to kind of socialize them?
Yeah. Right. And it's those subtle, invisible things that I think, you know, they're the hardest to change. Yeah.
You know, and they're the ones that touch the nerve when you say it. Someone's like, hey, you can't mess with that. And it's like, well, that's what we actually have to mess with.
Right, exactly.
You know, when he asked the question.
Yeah, that's true.
I'm curious, like, so obviously, so Boy Mom is just coming out at the time we're recording this.
Yeah.
You know, have you set your sights on where you might explore next? Is there like a sequel? Is there just like, you know, a research project, like you've gone from anxiety to
boys, to motherhood. I know. Like, well, I'm working on a fiction project at the moment. Who knows whether that will ever see the light of day? But cool. I wanted to sort of delve into something that was made up. I think had enough of the real world for a minute. But yeah, I'm sure I will write more nonfiction. I don't have a specific project that in mind, but yeah, I'm hoping to work on a novel.
That's all good, because I mean, there's a lot here too, right?
Yeah.
That needs to be unpacked, and I mean, even so far, just like the small point that your Substacks get a ton of engagement in terms of conversations back and forth. So it's like you definitely hit on something that people are trying to figure out and wrestle with. So it's like it's a good sign. I imagine it's a challenge, but it's a good sign to have that kind of back and forth.
Yeah, I want to have these conversations with people as long as they're civil. You know, I really want to talk to people and, you know, have people. And I love Substack because it gives you this chance to engage in a way that's a bit more, you know, a bit more nuanced than Twitter or whatever. You got a bit more space.
Yeah, 100%.
Yeah.
Awesome. Well, Ruth, I just want to say thank you so much for joining me on the pod. It's been a great conversation. Again, I really enjoyed the book. I'm excited to get it in the hands of listeners and watchers.
Thank you so much. It's been so great talking with you.
Thanks for doing it, you know.
Thank you.
And that wraps our deep dive into the nuances of modern masculinity, boyhood, and parenting with journalist Ruth Whippman. A huge thank you to Ruth for joining me on the podcast today. Now, it's clear that navigating boyhood in a rapidly changing society is layered with both challenges and opportunities for growth. And I hope we can carry forward this dialogue, nurturing spaces for vulnerability, connection, and a broader understanding of masculinity. And I'm curious, how did you engage with the boys and young men in your life to help foster a culture of empathy, understanding, and connection? Share your stories and thoughts with us on social media or over email. I'm always open and excited to hear from you. And remember, by engaging, you're not just contributing to an important conversation, but also shaping the collective understanding of masculinity for the better. And if you're looking to delve deeper into Ruth's work, you can check out her book, Boy Mom, which is available at the TAL bookstore. And as remember, shopping there supports Ruth, it supports independent bookstores, and it supports this podcast. So it's a win-win-win. Thank you once again for always tuning in. And thank you again for tuning in to This Anthro Life. It's always a pleasure to be here with you. I'm Adam Gamwell, and until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep listening beyond the surface.